the Liberal Party suffered a massive defeat in the 2025 federal election, and along with that defeat, Peter Dutton lost his own seat. So the Liberal Party is now in search of a new leader. So let's talk about some of the candidates and who the Liberal Party might be best off choosing. And of course, if you've all got any thoughts about it, well, let me know that in the comments below. Now, at the time of recording, there are a few leading contenders. We've got Angus Taylor, who was previously the Shadow Treasurer. We've got Susan Lee, who is the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party, and we've got some others floating around in the background, some of whom have declared they are not running, but might nevertheless be brought back into the race sometime down the track. These include people like Dan Tehan and Andrew Hastie, both of whom have declared that they are not starting for leadership. Then there's the possibility of Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price starting for leadership, although there are some complications surrounding her bid, and I'll get to that in a bit. There's also potentially Tim Wilson, who recently won the seat of Goldstein, who I think would probably be the best candidate, and I'll get to why later on. And then potentially Giselle Kaptarian, if she happens to capture Bradfield, but she hasn't been directly talked about at the moment. However, she could potentially become a contender in the future if this really spills out into being a complete calamity. Okay, so let's start with Angus Taylor. Like I said, Angus Taylor was the Shadow Treasurer. He's been tarnished by the Liberal Party's economic stance, or potentially lack thereof, when they were opposition. In particular, the Liberal Party failed to back in reducing the lowest income tax rate from 16% down to 14%. Furthermore, they completely botched their opposition to Division 296, which would have seen a tax on unrealised capital gains. Rather, the Liberal Party so failed in this that they effectively needed to defer any opposition to it to other outside parties, such as Wilson Asset Management. In essence, the Liberal Party dropped the ball entirely. They could have torn the Labour Party to shreds, but they didn't. Now, some of the blame for this has been laid at the feet of Angus Taylor, because he was the Shadow Treasurer. However, it's emerged that maybe Peter Dutton was really to blame for that shoddy economic performance, and Peter Dutton's prevarication and his inability to be decisive really stymied Angus Taylor, bringing the case to Jim Chalmers and making his case for an aspirational vision for the Liberal Party. Regardless, he's been tarnished by their poor performance, and if they were to choose him, they not only need to demonstrate that he was not to blame, but they need to show that through policies going forward. Furthermore, Angus Taylor is not the best speaker, and he just comes across as a little bit indecisive and uninspiring. Then we've got Susan Lee. Susan Lee, I think, is even worse. She does not come across as inspiring. She also comes across as similarly indecisive and inconclusive, and she also didn't develop terribly much policy in the prior opposition. Furthermore, she was deputy leader, so she should be wearing at least some of the blame for the poor performance of the opposition, at least as much as Angus Taylor. If Angus Taylor is going to be blamed for the bad economic policies, well, Susan Lee also needs to be blamed for the bad policies overall. So I think she should not be the leader. Furthermore, there are other things that count against her. These include seemingly backing in the idea of policing misinformation and disinformation, something that is profoundly unpopular overall, especially when people hear that the politicians themselves would be exempted from any such prohibitions.
X is vowing to fight on, Elon Musk vowing to fight on with vision that it wants to remain up on the social media platform. Are you for that or against it?
I'm for X obeying the law, and I'm not for the actions and the statements of our e-Safety Commissioner being ignored. We back her 100%. In government, we introduced the Online Safety Act. We want to see age verification tools put in place to prevent young people accessing both sinister and also really awful images on the net, and the government needs to progress that. They, for some reason, have stepped back from that age verification, but politicians, I think, are united in being very, very concerned about what our young people see online. And for some young people, there's no problem, and they can accept the context in which they see something. But for others who are vulnerable, it simply is not. It's not safe. And so I'm really disappointed with the approach that Elon Musk and the way he's taken over this company, and it's just a free-for-all, and it's not fair and it's not right.
But he argues that fine if you want to mute it here, but we should have no rights to be able to tell X what to do in its own country or other countries beyond our borders.
Well, that's patently ridiculous. Of course we should, and that's why we have an e-safety commissioner who has the resources and the evidence to understand what damage these images and this content does.
She's also backed in gender quotas, which are anathema to everything the Liberal Party stands for, which is of aspiration and ambition and merit. Quotas do not represent merit. Therefore, she just doesn't really hold up the Liberal Party's core ideology. Now, in terms of Angus Taylor and Susan Lee, it's sometimes talked about the idea that the Liberal Party went too far to the right and they were too conservative. To my mind, the Liberal Party was not at all conservative when it was in opposition. It failed to back in reducing the lowest marginal tax rate and failed to adequately resist Division 296. And it baked in all of the spending the Labour Party wanted to do. The Liberal Party was not sufficiently economically responsible. And on social policies, well, who knows really what they stood for? They seemingly were standing for censorship, which is not exactly popular. The Liberal Party simply didn't do their job in the last election. The issue was not that they were too conservative, as backers of Susan Lee have suggested. The issue was that they were incompetent. Then we've got some other contenders. Dan Tehan is one that's been mentioned. However, Dan Tehan has declared that he will not be standing for leadership. Now, the big problem Dan Tehan has is, I challenge you to find a photo of him where he is not frowning or scowling. And that is a massive problem. You can't be Prime Minister of Australia when you're permanently frowning at Australians. If he's to have any chance of any form of leadership, he needs to sort that out. He needs to stop frowning and potentially just have Botox to prevent it. It really is not going to work well for him if he is frowning at everyone. Then we've got Andrew Hastie. He's declared that he is not running, in large part because he's got a young family and he lives in Western Australia, so he doesn't really want to do the travel back and forth. That's fair enough, particularly if he really wants to be spending more time with his family at this point in time. However, he will risk missing out on his opportunity for leadership if he's waiting too long and if someone else competent happens to step up. Because, like I've said, I don't think Angus Taylor or Susan Lee are particularly good. However, there might be another candidate that could potentially take over and do a much better job than them. Now, Andrew Hastie could be good at this. He's charismatic, he has good leadership qualities, and he also speaks very well. Furthermore, he has a degree of policy acumen, although hasn't been in Parliament as long as some of the others. That will count for and against him. And furthermore, he was not tarnished, it seems, in the Brereton report into the SAS, in which Andrew Hastie had served. And therefore, his experience in the military probably serves him well from a leadership standpoint. The next one we've got is Tim Wilson. Tim Wilson has flagged that he might run for leadership, at least at the time of recording. I think Tim Wilson is the best possible candidate because if you look at his victory speech in Goldstein, he stood for aspiration and ambition and hard work and helping people get ahead. He stood for many of those core values that underscore why the Liberal Party has a case to make to the electorate, enabling people to get ahead if they work hard. And he supports a smaller government. In essence, he is standing for more individual liberty and freedom and aspiration, things that I think should be core to what the Liberal Party stands for. And therefore, I think Tim Wilson is by far the best of the candidates here. Tim Wilson also happens to be gay, so if Susan Lee is playing the identity politics card, well, also Tim Wilson could do so. Although, being more libertarian-leaning, Tim Wilson has not done so, because that isn't what the Liberal Party stands for. And then we have Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price. Now, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price sensationally defected from the National Party to the Liberal Party, potentially to cast a vote in favour of Angus Taylor as leadership, but it's also been mentioned that maybe she's trying to target Liberal leadership herself. Now, the big barrier to this is that Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price is in the Senate, and by convention, the leader of either of these two parties does not come from the Senate. And this is in large part because government business is generally done in the House of Representatives. There's no per se barrier to her being the leader of the Liberal Party, but I think it's incredibly unlikely she would be chosen given that she's in the Senate. I am also not convinced that her recent defection would count in her favour and would create significant complications with the Liberal Party managing the relationship with the Nationals, because the Nationals are not particularly happy about her changing parties or changing the parties that she sits with in the Senate. Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price also has the disadvantage that she seems to freewheel a little bit in press conferences, and that lack of message discipline might count against her. Now, in some ways that's refreshing. She says what is on her mind, and she calls it like she sees it. However, on the other hand, sometimes you need to be a little bit more diplomatic and be mindful of how you phrase things and where you phrase those things. And Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, I think, needs a little bit more practice at that. And let's face it, the Liberal Party needs to have someone who both carries core Liberal values, but also can increase their voter share from the last election. And increasing that voter share doesn't come from veering further and further to the left. Rather, it comes from standing for individual freedom, liberty, and aspiration, enabling people to get ahead through their hard work or through investment. That's what the Liberal Party stands for. It stands for reduced government control. The Liberal Party should contrast itself with the Labour Party. The Liberal Party should say that Liberals lift people up, whereas Labour tears people down when they happen to be successful. They could argue that Labour is the party of tall poppy syndrome, whereas Liberals are the party of aspiration. That's how they should be pitching themselves, and Tim Wilson, in my opinion, is the best person to carry that message. But do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you think should be Liberal leader? Do you think it should be any of the people I've mentioned, or do you think it should be someone else? I'd be interested to hear what you think.